Parallel universes are an interesting thing. The idea of worlds similar to our own yet somehow different has been a thought in people's minds for ages now, from alternate history to radically different futures. The world I'm talking about, however, isn't necessarily a scenario where our history differed slightly. This is a world of completely new nations, peoples, and wars, yet it all seems oddly familiar somehow. I've been looking into the lore of this world, and I've been finding it rather interesting, so consider this a light introduction of sorts. This is the world of Strangereal. So, what is Strangereal? Well, it's the world that the Ace Combat series of games are based in. The name apparently came from around the development of Ace Combat 4, where the franchise started to be pitched as being set in a strange real world, hence the eventual name. The idea behind Strangereal is that while it is very much on our Earth, same place in the solar system and everything, this is said explicitly, the landmass of this Earth came into different, yet again vaguely similar forms, and a new history arose from it. I keep pointing out the different yet vaguely similar part because that's the big premise of this world. It's set in the modern day, though sometimes a decade or so in the future, but it usually follows our timeline. The nations and people and cultures are obviously not total copies of our own, but they're close enough that parallels can clearly be seen. Everything about this world looks different, but when you pry just a little further, you start to see the creative parallels between it and our own world. In fact, let's start digging into some of the major players of this world. While the world of Strangereal has many different nations, each with their own spheres of influence or relation to the world's story, there are about 4 nations that hold major power and influence. The first of these nations is the Osean Federation, whose flag I actually showed off in my previous video. The Federation is the largest country on their home continent of Osea, taking up the entire western half while the rest is split up amongst mostly minor powers. Osea is a fairly young nation, having formed seemingly around the 19th century or so, and has been involved in expansionist conflicts pretty much since the beginning, including the Osean War in the beginning of the 20th century between Osea and Belka, which saw the first use of aircraft-based weaponry. Ever since, Osea has been gradually expanding either its territory or its influence, spreading their ideals and forming new markets the world over. If it's not obvious already, Osea is basically the Strangereal equivalent to America. In fact, Osea even entered into a Cold War with the Union of Yuktobanian Republics during the 80s and 90s in a similar reflection of America's Cold War with the Soviet Union, though our Cold War did last much longer. Speaking of Yuktobania, there really isn't much known about Yuktobania in terms of backstory. Most of its known history relates to events in the Ace Combat games directly. As the Strangereal version of the Soviet Union, Yuktobania serves as Osea's main rival on the other end of the world, trying to influence politics in its favor or simply against Osea, just as Osea does to it. For a while, though, there was peace between the two after the end of the Cold War until backroom machinations intentionally sparked a war between the two. Those backroom manipulators were part of the third nation on this list, Belka. Belka isn't a major power in the normal sense. It's dwarfed and often threatened by the presence of Osea to its immediate west, but this seems to have only strengthened Belkan aspirations for power and influence. They started the first Air Force during the Osean War at the start of the 20th century, and ever since have been trying to undermine Osean influence so as to open up power vacuums with which Belka can fill the void. Unlike the former two nations, Belka has maintained itself as a principality rather than any form of republic. This makes them a bit more unique among the major nations of Strangereal's Earth, though they aren't the only one. Erusia was at one point a republic similar to the likes of Osea, expansionism and all, but after a number of its conflicts ended in failure, the formerly deposed monarchy was re-established and has been ruling over the now Kingdom of Erusia ever since. Erusia is in an odd position as a somewhat unstable major power that is trying to play guardian to its home continent of Osea. It has to keep its internal affairs stable while also preventing both Osean and Yuktobanian influence in the area, making the continent sometimes serve as the focal point for both international cooperation as well as conflict. Now, with most major players out of the way, let's get a rough timeline going. The early 20th century saw the first use of airborne weaponry be used between the Osean Federation and Belka. Most of the timeline is fairly muddled after that, though, until we hit the 80s and 90s, where Osea and Yuktobania enter into a Cold War as their militaries and, more importantly, their nuclear arsenals increase. The two nations eventually put aside their differences in 1995 when Belka declared war against Osea and the neighboring nations whose territory formerly belonged to Belka. Yuktobania aided Osea in the war, and although Belka was defeated, it came at the cost of 7 nukes being detonated near the Belkan border, killing thousands of civilians in the process. During this, rebel groups in Osea attempted to seize the Scully Islands, but were also defeated. In 1997 and 1998, a massive coup was executed against the southern Osean nations who had agreed to a military pact with Osea, seeing the southern alliance with Osea as a betrayal from fellow Oseans, as well as an opening for Osea to undermine the Osean alliance's capabilities. The conflict lasted until 1998, and then, a year later in 1999, an asteroid dubbed Ulysses crashed on Earth, causing immense damage, death, and instability. This instability served as the foundation for the First Continental War between Erusia and the other Osean nations, as well as the Estovakian Civil War, where the minor nation of Estovakia was thrown into chaos by the asteroid impact and military forces fought over control of the country. In 2010, the peace between Osea and Yuktobania was finally broken when Yuktobania declared war, starting the Circum-Pacific War, a manipulation by a group of Belkans to weaken the superpower's influence so Belka could rise. By 2015, the Estovakian Civil War has ended, with a faction known as the Generals seizing power. The Generals proceed to declare war on their neighbor of Ameria, starting a new major conflict that only worsened conditions on their home continent of Anea. And finally, 4 years later in 2019, Erusian royalty would declare war on the Osean Federation and seize the space elevator on the Osean home continent, starting the Lighthouse War, as the Erusian princess had come to believe the cooperative reasoning behind the space elevator on Osea was a guise to increase Osean influence on their home continent, prompting the need to stop Osea before it becomes stronger. This didn't end well for Erusia, though, as ulterior motives were exposed, and Osea eventually broke the Erusian military and retook the space elevator. Now, this is a very rough timeline for most of the fairly documented history of the Strangereal Earth I could find. As you can tell, most of what is really known about the Strangereal Earth and its history comes directly from the game's stories. This also means that I didn't go into full excruciating detail here, because that would involve deeply explaining the plot of pretty much every single numbered Ace Combat game. I just wanted to give people a basic idea of this world's history, so I focused on the mainline titles and summarized them for the most part, rather than adding in things like spin-offs and stuff like that. And that is an explanation of the world of Strangereal. I've been getting into the Ace Combat games a bit, and I was getting interested once I figured out there's a lot of actual lore and history going on here. So of course I started digging around to get a good idea of what's going on. And this video is the result of that. I hope you enjoyed and found the history of this strange real world as interesting as I did. This has been TheRatMan, and I will see you all later. And lastly, a special thank you shout out to my Patreon, with $5 a month pledge is Punch McLarge Huge. Thank you for the $5.